Fog settles gently over a quiet English street, where nothing ever seems to happen. Doors open, habits repeat, and lives move in careful patterns. But on one pale morning, a single moment slips out of place. A woman hesitates, a handbag falls, and silence lingers too long. Miss Marple watches, listens, and remembers. Because when fog hides the truth, patience reveals it slowly, quietly, and without mercy for comfortable lies. Chapter 1. The fog that hid a moment too long. The fog arrived before dawn. It did not roll in dramatically or announce itself with wind or rain. It simply appeared, a soft white presence settling over the street as if it had always been there and the village had only just noticed it. By the time the first kettle was switched on and the first curtains were drawn, the fog had already claimed the road, the pavements, and the narrow row of houses that faced one another like polite neighbors who never quite spoke honestly. Foggy Street was not its real name, of course. It was called Hawthorne Row on the village map. But villagers had long ago given it another title. A private one spoken lightly and usually with a smile. Foggy Street. It earned the name honestly. The road sat lower than the rest of the village, and mornings often wrapped it in mist. Still, this fog felt different. Thicker. Quieter. As if sound itself had decided not to travel. Miss Marple noticed this from her bedroom window. She stood with her hands folded loosely before her and watched the pale shapes of houses emerge and disappear as the fog shifted. A lamppost stood at the corner, its light still burning faintly, even though the hour had passed when it should have switched off. The glow looked trapped like a candle behind frosted glass. Miss Marple did not dislike fog. She found it revealing in its own way. Fog stripped the world of detail and left only movement, habit, and outline. People believed it hid them. In truth, it often showed more than clear daylight ever could. Down below, a front door opened. Miss Marple watched carefully. Mrs. Linton from number 4 stepped out onto the pavement. She was wrapped in her wool coat despite the mild season and clutched her handbag tightly against her chest. She paused as she always did, adjusting her gloves. That was habit. Miss Marple approved of habits. They were the grammar of human behavior. When someone broke from them, something was usually amiss. Mrs. Linton hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough. She looked to her left, then to her right, and then back again toward her own door, as if reconsidering whether to step fully outside. The fog blurred her outline until she seemed half present, half imagined. Then, with a small, determined nod, she began walking down the street, disappearing slowly into the white. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Mrs. Linton never left the house before 7:30. Never. She liked her tea precisely brewed, and her morning radio program uninterrupted. Miss Marple had observed this pattern for years, not out of nosiness, but out of quiet interest. People repeated themselves endlessly, if one bothered to notice. The clock on Miss Marple's mantel read 6:50. Something else moved. A darker shape this time. A man, perhaps. Or someone wearing a longer coat. The figure crossed from one side of the street to the other directly in front of the lamppost. For just a moment the light caught the outline of a hat brim, then the fog swallowed it completely. Miss Marple leaned forward. She waited for the sound of footsteps. They did not come. That was odd. Even in fog, sound usually traveled well. Shoes on stone. A cough. The rustle of fabric. But the street remained silent, except for the distant call of a bird, uncertain whether morning had truly arrived. Miss Marple stepped back from the window and reached for her cardigan. She did not hurry. There was no need. Whatever had occurred had already happened. Hurrying only made one miss the subtleties that followed. By the time she reached her front door, the fog had thickened further. It pressed close like a curtain drawn too soon. Miss Marple stepped outside, carefully closing the door behind her with a soft click. She paused on the threshold, letting her eyes adjust. The pavement felt damp beneath her sensible shoes. The air smelled faintly of cold stone and something else. Something metallic, perhaps. Or perhaps that was imagination. Fog encouraged the imagination. She walked slowly toward the lamppost. Halfway down the street she saw it. A handbag lay near the curb. Miss Marple stopped. It was not overturned dramatically. It lay on its side as if it had simply been set down and forgotten. The clasp was still closed. The leather was scuffed, but well cared for. Miss Marple recognized it at once. Mrs. Linton's handbag. Miss Marple did not touch it. She crouched slightly to examine its position. The handle faced the street, not the pavement. That suggested it had been carried rather than placed. Dropped, perhaps, or taken from a hand suddenly loosened. She straightened. The fog shifted again, and for just a moment the far end of the street became visible. Miss Marple saw nothing out of place. No sign of a struggle. No figure hurrying away. Just empty road and pale houses, watching silently. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening at the back of her thoughts. This was not panic. Panic was loud. This was something else. Recognition. She turned slowly in a circle, taking in the doorways, the hedges, the windows. Several curtains twitched. She noted which ones moved and which remained still. She would remember that later. Miss Marple took one step back toward her house. She did not pick up the handbag. Not yet. By 8 o'clock, Foggy Street was no longer quiet. The fog had thinned slightly, but it still clung stubbornly to the lower half of the road, like a secret refusing to be released all at once. Voices drifted now, concerned murmurs, polite questions, and the faint edge of excitement that people tried unsuccessfully to disguise as worry. Mrs. Linton had not returned. Her front door stood ajar. Miss Marple observed this from across the street as several neighbors gathered near the doorstep. She stood slightly apart, leaning on her umbrella, though the ground was dry. It gave her a reason to pause and listen, without appearing to intrude. Mrs. Hargreaves was speaking in a tone that suggested she had already decided how the situation should be understood. I expect she simply went out early and forgot to lock up. You know how she can be when she's distracted. Miss Marple tilted her head. Mrs. Linton was never distracted. Mr. Doyle, from number 9, shook his head. Her handbag was found halfway down the street. Yes, but that doesn't mean anything dreadful, Mrs. Hargreaves insisted too quickly. She's always misplacing things. Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Hargreaves. Her hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles pale. She kept glancing toward the foggy end of the road as if expecting something to emerge, or hoping nothing would. The constable arrived shortly after. A young man, polite and earnest, who looked faintly embarrassed by the attention. He asked careful questions and wrote notes in a small book. Miss Marple noticed he did not ask about the fog. That omission interested her. She stepped forward just enough to be noticed. "Good morning, Constable," she said gently. He turned with relief. Older villagers often carried authority without effort. "Good morning, miss. I was awake early," she continued. "I noticed Mrs. Linton leave the house before 7. Several heads turned." Mrs. Hargreaves frowned. "Are you sure?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Quite sure." She hesitated at the door, which is unusual for her. The constable scribbled something. "Did you see where she went?" Miss Marple shook her head. Only that she walked toward the far end of the street. Into the fog. There was a small pause. Fog had become the unspoken character in the gathering. Everyone was thinking of it. No one wished to blame it openly. "And the handbag," Miss Marple added. It was lying closer to the curb than the pavement. Handles facing the road. The constable looked up. "What does that suggest to you, miss? That it was dropped while walking rather than set down deliberately?" Miss Marple replied. "Or taken from a hand that suddenly relaxed?" Silence followed. Mrs. Hargreaves gave a small, nervous laugh. Now, let's not imagine things." Miss Marple did not respond. Imagination was not required when observation sufficed. The constable cleared his throat. We'll conduct a search of the area. She may have slipped or taken a fall." Miss Marple nodded politely. Of course. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple remained where she was. She watched Mrs. Hargreaves retreat into her house, closing the door with more force than necessary. She watched Mr. Doyle linger by his gate longer than usual, pretending to inspect a hinge that did not need attention. Most of all, she watched the fog. It thinned steadily, now lifting in uneven patches. Where it cleared, the street looked ordinary again. Harmless. Respectable. Miss Marple knew better. Fog did not cause events. It enabled them. She walked slowly back to her own front step and sat down. From there she could see both ends of the street. She could also see the handbag still lying where it had been found, now marked with a small chalk circle. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She thought of how people behaved when they believed they were unseen, how easily assumptions replaced certainty, how quickly the human mind filled in gaps with what felt comfortable rather than what was true. Someone on Foggy Street had relied on the fog. Someone had believed that blurred vision meant blurred memory. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Fog cleared eventually, and when it did, it often revealed not confusion, but design. Chapter 1 had ended. The street did not yet know it. Chapter 2, familiar faces acting strangely. The village liked a simple explanation. It liked the sort that could be spoken over a teacup and finished before the biscuits softened. It liked a neat conclusion that required no uncomfortable questions and no serious reordering of old opinions. So by late morning, several versions of Mrs. Linton's disappearance had already formed and travelled from kitchen to kitchen like steam rising from kettles. She had gone out early and slipped on the damp pavement. She had wandered in the fog and lost her sense of direction. She had felt unwell and sat down somewhere and was now waiting for someone to find her. There were even those who spoke, in lowered voices, of a private matter that had driven her away without warning. People could invent entire lives for a neighbour, if given half a chance. Miss Marple listened to all of it with a steady calm. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She simply gathered each remark as if it were a thread, noting where it was strong, where it was frayed, and where it had been tied into a knot to hide its weakness. Around noon she walked to the little village shop. She went partly because she needed tea, and partly because the shop was the most reliable stage in the village. People entered intending to buy bread, and left having performed their most honest selves, without realizing. The fog had lifted almost entirely now. Sunlight lay over the hedges and rooftops, pale and hesitant, as if it too was uncertain whether it should trust the day. Hawthorne Row looked ordinary again. The chalk circle remained on the pavement where the handbag had been found. A constable stood nearby speaking with Mr. Doyle. A second young officer examined the verge beside the road, as though expecting a clue to rise up and introduce itself. As Miss Marple approached, she heard Mr. Doyle's voice. "I have told you, Constable, I did not hear a thing. I was still asleep." His tone was reasonable. His words were helpful. Yet something about the timing did not sit comfortably. Miss Marple watched him as she drew near. Mr. Doyle was a tidy man, a retired clerk, always polite, always crisp. Even his hair seemed to obey rules. Today his collar was fastened correctly, and his shoes were well shined. But his hands were not quite steady. He kept flexing his fingers as if they had been cold, though the air was mild. The constable thanked him and turned away. Miss Marple continued on without stopping. At the shop, the bell above the door rang brightly, almost too cheerfully for the mood of the village. Mrs. Peters, who ran the place, stood behind the counter, arranging jars. She looked up with relief when she saw Miss Marple, as if an older familiar face could soothe the entire room. "Miss Marple, what a morning. Have you heard the latest?" "I have heard several versions," Miss Marple replied gently. "One never knows which is the latest when they change every few minutes." Mrs. Peters leaned forward. They say she simply wandered off. But that doesn't sound like Mrs. Linton, does it? No, Miss Marple said softly. It does not. A woman at the bread shelf, Mrs. Hargreaves, turned her head sharply. Her face brightened with a smile that appeared too quickly. Miss Marple, I suppose you have come to reassure us. You always do. It will all be sorted out, I am sure. Miss Marple returned the smile. I do hope so. Mrs. Hargreaves lifted a loaf as if it were an excuse to keep her hands busy. She avoided looking directly at Mrs. Peters. The shop felt warmer than usual, though the stove was not lit. The warmth came from bodies pressed close, and from the low hum of anxious talk. Miss Marple chose her tea carefully, then allowed herself to linger by the counter. Mrs. Peters lowered her voice. Did you see the door? Mrs. Linton left it open. She would never do that. Miss Marple nodded. That is true. And another thing, Mrs. Peters continued. Her curtains were not drawn properly this morning. I noticed because I deliver newspapers sometimes. Her lace curtain was pulled back as if she had been looking out, not just stepping out. Miss Marple's eyes softened. That is interesting. Mrs. Hargreaves spoke again, too brightly. Perhaps she was watching the weather. Fog does that to people. Makes them restless. Miss Marple tilted her head. Does it make you restless, Mrs. Hargreaves? Mrs. Hargreaves laughed quickly. Oh, I am never restless. I dislike fuss. Miss Marple studied her. Mrs. Hargreaves disliked fuss, the way a cat disliked water. Loudly, dramatically, and with constant attention. She was the sort who claimed to be quiet, while ensuring everyone watched her behave. A young man came in then, the postman, Samuel Finch. He removed his cap and cleared his throat as if stepping onto a stage. They found nothing along the lane, he announced. I walked the whole stretch toward the allotments. Not a sign. Mrs. Peters pressed her lips together. That is dreadful. Samuel looked at Miss Marple with the eager seriousness of someone who wanted to be useful. They are saying she may have gone toward the river path. The river path is slippery, Mrs. Hargreaves said quickly. So you see, it could be an accident. Miss Marple's voice stayed mild. An accident is certainly possible. But accidents do not usually leave handbags in the middle of the street. There was a pause. The bell above the door rang again as another customer entered, but no one turned. It was as though the entire shop held its breath. Mrs. Hargreaves set her loaf down too firmly, then lifted it again with an awkward motion. Mrs. Linton was forgetful at times. Miss Marple's gaze met hers. Was she? Mrs. Hargreaves blinked. Well, I mean, people can be forgetful without it showing. Miss Marple let the silence rest for a moment. Then she turned slightly toward Mrs. Peters. Who last saw Mrs. Linton yesterday evening, she asked. Mrs. Peters frowned. She came in before closing, bought her usual tea and some marmalade. She was perfectly composed. Samuel Finch chimed in. I delivered a letter to her yesterday afternoon. She seemed alert. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did she mention expecting anyone this morning? Mrs. Peters shook her head. No. But she did ask about the train times to Little Barton. Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple noticed. Mrs. Peters continued. It was an odd question. She doesn't travel much. She asked what time the early train was. I told her. She thanked me and said she might need it soon. Samuel frowned. Did she say why? No, Mrs. Peters admitted. Only that she had something to settle. Miss Marple selected her change carefully, as if the coins required her full attention. But her mind was already arranging the pieces. A need to settle something. An early departure. A curtain pulled back as if watching. A hesitation at the door. A handbag dropped, not placed. Then the fog. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Peters and turned toward the door. As she did, she heard Mrs. Hargreaves speak in a soft, urgent tone. Mrs. Peters, you should not repeat private matters. People will talk. Mrs. Peters replied, a little defensive. People are talking already. Outside, Miss Marple paused on the pavement. The air felt brighter, yet the street did not feel clearer. The fog had gone from the road, but it remained in the minds of the villagers. Each person clung to their preferred version, their comfortable shadow. Miss Marple began walking slowly back toward Hawthorne Row. Halfway there, she saw a detail she had not noticed earlier. Near the chalk circle on the pavement, faint in the drying damp, there was a scuff mark. Not large, not dramatic, just a thin smear as if a shoe had slid, or as if something had been dragged for a brief moment before being lifted again. A shoe might slip. A shoe might also scramble. Miss Marple looked up and saw Mr. Doyle standing in his doorway watching the officers with careful stillness. As she met his eyes, he smiled politely. It was a correct smile. But it arrived a moment too late. In the afternoon, the village tried to return to routine. Kettles boiled. Radios played softly. Doors opened and closed with the familiar rhythm of daily life. Yet every sound carried an extra note. Every small action seemed performed rather than lived. The village was acting normal, and that effort made it feel less normal than ever. Miss Marple sat in her front room with a cup of tea that had gone slightly cool. She did not mind. A cool cup often lasted longer, and longer was what she needed. Through the lace curtain she watched Hawthorne Row as one might watch a theatre scene, noting entrances, exits, and pauses. Around 3 o'clock, Mrs. Hargreaves came out of her house. She was carrying a basket as if she were about to do something wholesome. She walked briskly toward the village green, then stopped as if remembering something and turned back. Halfway back to her door, she paused again, looked down the street, then hurried inside. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. That was not the behavior of someone who disliked fuss. That was the behavior of someone waiting for a particular moment. Or waiting for someone. Miss Marple rose and put on her coat. She did not hurry. She stepped outside and walked slowly toward the far end of Hawthorne Row, where the road dipped toward the hedged lane. The fog had entirely lifted now, and the lane was clear, but the memory of the morning remained as a kind of stain. Near the corner she saw Constable Harris again. He stood with his notebook open speaking to Mrs. Peters, who had closed the shop for a few minutes to answer questions. Mrs. Peters looked tired, her hands still holding the edge of her apron, as if clinging to something familiar. Miss Marple approached. "Good afternoon, Constable," she said. He brightened. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. We are doing what we can." "I am sure," Miss Marple replied. "Has anyone searched behind the row of houses? The little path that runs along the back gardens?" Constable Harris hesitated. "We have checked the main lanes and the river path. The back gardens are private property." Miss Marple's tone stayed gentle. "They are private, but they are also connected. A person could pass from one to another rather easily if they knew where the low fences are." Mrs. Peters looked startled. "Do you think she went through gardens?" "I do not know," Miss Marple said. "But if she intended to meet someone without being seen, the fog would have helped, and the gardens would have helped as well." Constable Harris shifted his weight. He was young enough to dislike accusing anyone, but old enough to know that disappearing adults rarely vanished without context. "I will mention it," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Also, Mrs. Peters told me Mrs. Linton asked about the early train." The constable looked up sharply. "Did she? That is important." Mrs. Peters sighed. "I did not think it meant anything at the time." Miss Marple's voice softened. "One rarely does. That is how such things happen." As Miss Marple turned away, a car passed slowly along the street. It was a dark saloon, polished, respectable. It moved with caution as if the driver did not wish to appear hurried. It stopped briefly near Mr. Doyle's house, the window lowered slightly. Miss Marple could not hear what was said, but she saw Mr. Doyle step forward and lean in. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. Then the car moved on. Miss Marple stood still. Mr. Doyle returned to his doorway, glanced up the street, and then went inside quickly. Miss Marple did not follow. Not yet. People often ran to the loudest clue. Miss Marple preferred the quietest ones, the kind that thought they were invisible. She walked instead toward the back path. There was a narrow passage between two hedges, known to children as a shortcut, and to adults as something that should not be mentioned. It led behind the houses where gardens stretched in long rectangles, separated by low fences and climbing rose bushes. The air smelled of damp earth and winter green. Miss Marple moved slowly along the path, her shoes quiet on the packed soil. She paused at each point where the hedges dipped or the fences sagged. She could see how easily someone could slip through. A careful person could move from garden to garden without ever stepping onto the road. Near the back of number 4, Mrs. Linton's house, Miss Marple stopped. The back gate was slightly open. Miss Marple looked at it thoughtfully. A gate left ajar was not proof. But it was a suggestion, like a half-spoken sentence. She leaned closer and saw a mark on the wooden post, a faint scrape as if something had brushed against it, leaving a pale line in the darker paint. It could have been a basket. It could have been a coat button. It could have been a hand that clutched too tightly. She stepped back and looked along the garden line. In the neighboring garden, number 6, belonged to Mrs. Hargreaves. A small shed stood near the fence. Its door was closed, but the latch was not fully down. It sat slightly raised, as if someone had been in a hurry and did not take time to secure it properly. Miss Marple felt that tightening again, that quiet recognition. She did not go to the shed door. That would be too direct. Directness alarmed people, and alarm made them either lie better or flee faster. Instead, she continued walking, moving past the gardens until she reached the end of the path near the lane. From there she could see the river path in the distance, and beyond it the line of trees. She could also see, tucked between hedges, a small side gate that led out from the garden line into the lane. It was the sort of gate one might use if one wished to leave without being seen from the front street. Miss Marple stood still, listening. Birdsong. A dog barking somewhere. The faint sound of a distant tractor. Ordinary things. Comforting things. But beneath them, the village still held its breath. She returned the way she had come, and as she passed behind Mr. Doyle's garden, she noticed a small patch of earth that looked recently disturbed. Not dug. Not planted. Simply pressed down, as if someone had stood there for a moment longer than necessary. A human pause often left a mark. Miss Marple reached the front street again, just as the afternoon light began to turn golden. Mrs. Hargreaves emerged once more, this time without her basket. She stepped onto the pavement, saw Miss Marple, and smiled brightly. "Oh, Miss Marple. Out for a little stroll? It is good to keep moving, isn't it? No sense sitting and worrying." Miss Marple returned the smile. "Quite. Though worry does not always require sitting." Mrs. Hargreaves laughed as if that were a charming joke. "Have you heard anything new?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head too quickly. "Nothing. Nothing at all. The police are handling it. And the fog? Well, fog confuses people. I am sure it is all just confusion." Miss Marple's eyes remained kind. Confusion is indeed common, but it is rarely tidy. Mrs. Hargreaves' smile faltered for the briefest moment. Then she recovered. "You do have a way with words, Miss Marple." "Do I?" Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Hargreaves turned toward her door. "I must get on. My supper will not cook itself." As she went inside, Miss Marple watched the door close. The latch clicked. A careful sound. Miss Marple stood a moment longer in the street, listening to the quiet. She was beginning to see the shape of something. Not yet the full picture, but the outline. Familiar faces, familiar habits, and today, the small fractures in them. Somewhere in those fractures, the truth was waiting. And it was calmer than anyone expected. Chapter 3: The Street That Remembers Everything. Hawthorne Row had always been proud of its memory. The houses stood close together, brick shoulders nearly touching, as if they leaned toward one another to whisper about the lives inside. Paint colors changed. Curtains were replaced. Children grew and moved away. Yet the street itself remembered footsteps, routines, and the invisible paths people took when they thought no one was watching. Miss Marple walked that street as if she were reading a familiar book. She did not rush. She let the morning shape itself around her. Sunlight now lay fully across the pavement, revealing the faint chalk line where Mrs. Linton's handbag had been found. The chalk had smudged slightly overnight, disturbed by shoes and the curiosity of those who stood just a moment too long. Even that told a story. People lingered where they pretended not to care. Miss Marple paused near number 4. Mrs. Linton's house was quiet. Curtains drawn now, though they had not been earlier. That change mattered. Someone had drawn them after the disappearance. Someone had decided the interior should not be seen. Miss Marple lifted her gaze to the upstairs window. The lace curtain hung evenly, careful, and neat. Mrs. Linton had never been overly neat. She liked order, yes, but she allowed small signs of life to remain. A curtain slightly crooked. A pot left soaking. Neatness after disorder often meant anxiety. Miss Marple stepped closer to the door and listened. Nothing. She moved on. Across the street, Mr. Doyle was in his front garden. He knelt beside a rosebush, trimming it with deliberate care. The stems had already been cut recently. There was no urgent need. Yet he snipped and adjusted as if the task were essential to his peace. Miss Marple approached quietly. "Good morning, Mr. Doyle," she said. He startled, only slightly, but enough. "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning." His smile appeared quickly this time, too quickly perhaps, as if he had been practicing it. "Such a lovely day after the fog," Miss Marple continued. "It is surprising how quickly things clear." "Yes," Mr. Doyle replied. "Surprising." He wiped his hands on a cloth, though there was little dirt on them. "You were awake early yesterday," Miss Marple said gently. "Or perhaps not. You mentioned you were asleep." Mr. Doyle straightened. "Yes, as I said. I sleep soundly," Miss Marple nodded. "Sound sleepers are fortunate. Though sometimes even they wake briefly without remembering." Mr. Doyle's eyes flickered. "I do not recall waking." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Memory can be selective." She looked at the roses. "You have trimmed these twice this week." He followed her gaze. "They grow quickly." "Do they?" Miss Marple said softly. She thanked him and moved on before the conversation could harden into something defensive. Further along the street, Mrs. Hargreaves stood at her window. She pretended to be arranging a vase, but her eyes followed Miss Marple's progress. When Miss Marple looked up, Mrs. Hargreaves smiled and waved. Miss Marple waved back. The wave was returned, but Mrs. Hargreaves did not move away from the window. The street remembered glances, as well as footsteps. Miss Marple reached the far end of Hawthorne Row and turned back, walking the other side now. She studied doorsteps. She studied garden edges. She studied the small gaps where hedges met walls, and where children once squeezed through to retrieve lost balls. Near number 6, Mrs. Hargreaves' house, she noticed something new. A faint line on the pavement, almost invisible in the brightening sun, a smear that curved slightly toward the curb. It matched the scuff near the handbag. Together they formed a path, brief but intentional. Miss Marple followed it with her eyes. It led toward the narrow alley that ran behind the houses. She did not follow immediately. Instead, she stood still and listened to the street. There was the sound of a radio playing softly somewhere. A kettle whistling briefly, then falling silent. The clatter of a gate. Ordinary sounds, comforting sounds, and beneath them, the hum of unease. Miss Marple turned and walked back toward her own house. Inside, she sat by the window and poured herself another cup of tea. This one, she drank slowly. She allowed her thoughts to arrange themselves. Mrs. Linton had intended to go somewhere. She had asked about a train. She had drawn her curtain as if waiting. She had hesitated at the door. She had stepped into the fog with her handbag, then lost it abruptly. Someone had known she would come out. Someone had known the fog would help. Someone had believed the street would forget. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Streets did not forget. They stored impressions quietly until someone came along who knew how to listen. She finished her tea and rose again. It was time to walk the path behind the houses properly. The alley was narrow and shaded by hedges that had grown thick over the years. Sunlight filtered through in uneven patches, creating bright pools and darker stretches where the earth remained cool and damp. Miss Marple moved carefully, her shoes making little sound. Behind number 4, she paused again at the back gate. It remained slightly open. She pushed it gently. It swung inward with a faint creak. The garden beyond was tidy but not overly so. A small table, a chair, a line of potted herbs near the wall. Everything suggested a woman who liked to sit quietly and think. Miss Marple looked at the chair. It was angled toward the back gate. Mrs. Linton had been waiting. Miss Marple stepped back into the alley and continued along. At the fence dividing number 4 and number 6, the boards were low. A person could step over easily. Miss Marple did not step over. She leaned forward and looked. On the ground near the fence was a small indentation, as if a heel had pressed down hard. The earth was compacted in a way that suggested weight and urgency. Miss Marple followed the line. It led toward the shed in Mrs. Hargreaves's garden. The shed door was now fully closed. The latch was down. Miss Marple stood very still. She did not approach the door. Instead, she listened. There was no sound from within. But silence could be active or passive. This silence felt arranged. Miss Marple moved on. At the end of the alley, she came to the side gate that opened onto the lane. It was closed, but not locked. She touched the latch lightly. It lifted without resistance. Beyond lay the lane, quiet and sunlit, leading toward the river path and the allotments beyond. Miss Marple closed the gate gently. She returned the way she had come, her mind now heavy with impressions. Not proof. Not yet. But shape. Direction. When she reached the front street again, she saw Mrs. Peters standing outside her shop, speaking with Constable Harris. Both looked up as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Marple," the constable said, "we have found nothing yet." "Not finding something can be as useful as finding it," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Peters looked at her anxiously. "Do you think she might have left the village?" "It is possible," Miss Marple said, "but I do not think she intended to disappear." Constable Harris frowned. "What makes you say that?" "People who plan to disappear take their handbag," Miss Marple said gently. The constable nodded slowly. Miss Marple looked back down the street. Mrs. Hargreaves's curtains were now drawn. Earlier they had been open. Change again. She felt the street pressing its memory toward her, eager to be understood. That evening, Hawthorne Row settled into an uneasy calm. Lights came on behind curtains. The smell of cooking drifted through open windows. The day pretended to end normally, but the night felt watchful. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, though she barely glanced at it. Her needles moved from habit rather than attention. Across the street, a light flicked on in Mrs. Hargreaves's front room. Then off again, on again. Then steady. Miss Marple noted the pattern. Later, Mr. Doyle emerged briefly to place his rubbish bin by the curb. He glanced both ways before doing so, as if checking for something beyond traffic. He lingered, then went back inside quickly. Miss Marple's knitting paused. She waited. At 9:30, a car approached slowly. The same dark saloon from the afternoon. It did not stop this time. It passed through the street and turned the corner toward the lane. Miss Marple rose. She put on her coat and stepped outside. The night air was cool and carried sound well. The car's engine faded, then stopped. Miss Marple walked toward the alley. She did not hurry. She did not hide. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere. The alley was darker now. She paused, listening. From the direction of the lane came a murmur of voices. Low, urgent, then silence. Miss Marple moved forward again. At the side gate, she stopped. The gate was open. Miss Marple stood very still. Beyond, the lane lay quiet. The car was parked further down, partially hidden by hedges. Two figures stood near it, one taller, one shorter. They spoke briefly, then one gestured sharply. The shorter figure turned back toward the gate. Miss Marple stepped into the shadow of the hedge. Mrs. Hargreaves emerged into the alley. Her face was pale in the low light. She looked around quickly, then moved toward the shed. Her steps were careful, measured. Miss Marple followed at a distance. Mrs. Hargreaves stopped at the shed door and hesitated. She reached for the latch, then paused again as if listening for something that might betray her. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Good evening, Mrs. Hargreaves," she said calmly. Mrs. Hargreaves gasped. Her hand flew to her chest. "Miss Marple, you frightened me." "I apologize," Miss Marple replied. "I was taking the air. One sleeps better afterward." Mrs. Hargreaves laughed nervously. "Yes, of course. I was just checking my tools." "At this hour," Miss Marple said gently, "I like to be organized." Mrs. Hargreaves replied too quickly. Miss Marple glanced at the shed. "May I?" Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened. "May you what?" "Look inside," Miss Marple said. "It is quite dark. You might trip." Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head. "There is no need." Miss Marple did not move. She did not press. She simply waited. Silence grew heavy. Finally, Mrs. Hargreaves spoke, her voice tight. "You always think you see more than others, don't you?" Miss Marple's voice was kind. "I see what people show when they think no one is looking." Mrs. Hargreaves swallowed. "There is nothing in there." "Then there is no harm," Miss Marple said softly. Another pause. Mrs. Hargreaves's shoulders sagged slightly. She stepped aside and lifted the latch. The shed door opened. Inside, among gardening tools and boxes, sat Mrs. Linton. She was alive. She looked frightened and exhausted, her coat still wrapped tightly around her. Her handbag clutched in her lap. Miss Marple stepped forward at once. "Mrs. Linton," she said gently, "you are safe now." Mrs. Hargreaves began to speak, her words tumbling over one another. "She came to me. She was going to tell. I only wanted time. Just time." Miss Marple nodded. "And you used the fog." Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt her." Miss Marple looked at Mrs. Linton. "What were you going to tell her?" Mrs. Linton's voice shook. "About the money. About what she did years ago. About how she blamed another." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The street remembered everything. And now, at last, it was ready to speak. Chapter 4, A Lie That Could Not Stay Quiet. The shed door remained open. Moonlight slipped across the threshold, pale and steady, touching the edges of rakes and pots and the small wooden stool on which Mrs. Linton sat. The night did not rush the moment. It allowed it to breathe. Miss Marple moved first. She stepped inside and knelt beside Mrs. Linton, placing one steady hand over the other woman's trembling fingers. Her voice was low and even, the sort that calmed animals and unsettled liars in equal measure. "You are quite safe now," she said. "Nothing more will happen to you." Mrs. Linton nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the floor. Her breathing was shallow. as if she feared drawing too much attention to herself even now. Mrs. Hargreaves stood just outside the shed, hands clenched, her face caught between defiance and relief. She looked like someone who had held a door shut for too long, and suddenly found it open. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Mrs. Hargreaves," she said, "it would be best if you fetched Constable Harris. He will wish to hear everything." Mrs. Hargreaves's lips parted. For a moment it seemed she might argue, then her shoulders sagged. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, of course." She turned and walked down the alley without looking back. Miss Marple waited until her footsteps faded, then turned her attention fully to Mrs. Linton. "You were waiting for someone this morning," Miss Marple said gently. "At the back gate?" Mrs. Linton nodded again. "I thought it would be easier there. Less gossip. Less looking." "You believe the fog would help," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Mrs. Linton whispered. "I did not wish to make a scene." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Scenes rarely begin with raised voices. They usually begin with silence." Mrs. Linton looked up then. "I never meant for this. I only wanted her to admit it." "Just to admit it?" Miss Marple pulled the stool closer and sat opposite her. "Admit what, my dear?" Mrs. Linton swallowed. "The money. Years ago, when Mr. Hargreaves died, everyone believed it was an accident, a bad investment. But it was not. She moved funds. Quietly. Blamed someone else. A clerk who lost his position. His family left the village in disgrace." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "I found the papers last month," Mrs. Linton continued. "Old bank statements. A name crossed out, another written in. I knew then. I could not unknow it. And you went to Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said. "Yes. I told her I would go to the police if she did not make it right. She asked for time. Just a little time." Miss Marple nodded. "Time is a dangerous gift." Mrs. Linton's fingers tightened around her handbag. "She asked me to come early. Said we could talk privately. She said the fog would keep people from staring." Miss Marple's gaze softened, and instead it kept people from seeing. "Yes," Mrs. Linton said, her voice breaking. "When she pushed me inside the shed, I thought she meant to kill me." Miss Marple shook her head. "She meant to delay you, and to frighten you into silence." Mrs. Linton looked down. "It worked. I was afraid." Miss Marple reached out and touched her hand again. "Fear does not make you weak. It makes you human." They sat together in the quiet, until footsteps returned. Constable Harris arrived first, his expression shifting quickly from confusion to concern to grim understanding as he took in the scene. Another officer followed. Mrs. Hargreaves stood behind them, her face pale, eyes fixed on the ground. Miss Marple spoke calmly, clearly laying out the sequence of events as she understood them. She did not embellish. She did not accuse. She simply described what the street had shown her. The constable listened intently. "So the fog was used as cover," he said finally, "and the alley and the gardens." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and the assumption that people would prefer a harmless explanation." Mrs. Hargreaves spoke then, her voice shaking. "I never meant to hurt her. I only wanted time. To fix things. To put the money back somehow." Constable Harris looked at her steadily. "You confined her against her will." "I know," Mrs. Hargreaves whispered. "I panicked." Miss Marple watched her carefully. Panic explained many things, but not all. Panic did not explain the careful closing of curtains, or the rehearsed denial, or the second meeting by car in the lane. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said softly, "who was in the car this afternoon." Mrs. Hargreaves flinched. "No one important. That is not an answer," Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated. "A solicitor. From Little Barton." Constable Harris's pen paused. "What was the purpose of that meeting?" "To ask how to undo what I had done," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "To protect myself." Miss Marple nodded. Protection often arrives too late. Mrs. Linton was helped from the shed and guided toward the waiting police car. She moved slowly, stiffly, but she walked on her own. As she passed Mrs. Hargreaves, she did not look at her. That absence of looking carried more weight than anger. Miss Marple remained in the alley as the officers departed. The shed door was closed again, this time properly. The latch clicked down with finality. The lie had not survived the night. It rarely did. Morning came quietly to Hawthorne Row. The village woke as it always did, but something fundamental had shifted. News moved faster than usual, carried not by excitement but by relief. Mrs. Linton was alive. The fog had not taken her. And the truth, long buried, had surfaced at last. Miss Marple sat at her window with a fresh cup of tea. She watched as neighbours emerged, speaking in hushed tones, their faces composed but thoughtful. People were recalibrating their memories, fitting new understanding into old impressions. Across the street, Mr. Doyle stood at his gate, speaking to a neighbour. His voice sounded lighter, freer. The burden he had carried by proximity alone had lifted. Mrs. Hargreaves's house remained closed. Curtains drawn. No movement. Miss Marple did not feel satisfaction. Only a quiet completeness. Later that morning, Constable Harris came by to thank her. He stood on the step, hat in hand. "We will be taking Mrs. Hargreaves in for questioning," he said, "and there will be an investigation into the old matter." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is as it should be." He hesitated. "You saw it all very clearly." Miss Marple smiled. "I did not see. I listened." When he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair. She picked up her knitting and worked a few rows, letting the rhythm settle her thoughts. She thought of how easily a village accepted a lie when it spared them discomfort. How readily fog was blamed for what people preferred not to examine. How a single morning could reveal years of quiet injustice. In the afternoon, Mrs. Peters came by with a small parcel of biscuits and an expression of gratitude mixed with awe. "We would have believed anything," she said, "if it meant things stayed simple." Miss Marple accepted the biscuits. Simplicity is often the most complicated thing of all. As the day wore on, the street seemed to relax. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then more freely. Children played. Doors were left open again. Yet Hawthorne Row would not forget. It would remember the fog, the hesitation at a door, the handbag on the pavement, the lie that had tried to remain quiet and failed. Miss Marple looked out at the street one last time as evening approached. The light softened, touching the bricks with warmth. Truth did not need drama. It needed patience. And patience, Miss Marple knew, always outlasted deception. Chapter 5. When the fog finally clears. The village woke to a different silence. It was not the strained quiet that followed confusion or fear. It was softer, looser. The kind that settled after a storm had passed and left behind clean air and rearranged branches. Hawthorne Row breathed again, cautiously at first, as if uncertain whether calm could be trusted. Miss Marple rose early. Habit guided her as it always did, but this morning carried a sense of conclusion. She opened her curtains fully and let the light come in without hesitation. Outside, the street lay clear and bright. No fog lingered. No shadows clung to corners. The houses looked as they always had, yet not quite the same. Knowledge had altered their posture. She dressed and went downstairs, moving with unhurried grace. The kettle sang. Tea was poured. She carried her cup to the front window and watched the day begin. Mrs. Linton's house showed signs of life. A curtain shifted. A window opened slightly. Fresh air entered a space that had held fear only days before. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction at that simple movement. Survival was often announced by the smallest gestures. At mid-morning, Mrs. Linton herself appeared at the door. She moved carefully, as one does after a shock, but her back was straight. She stepped onto the pavement and stood there for a moment, letting the familiar stones ground her. Then she began to walk, slowly, deliberately, down the street. Miss Marple put on her coat and stepped outside. They met near the spot where the chalk mark had once been. The mark was gone now, washed away by rain and footsteps. Only memory remained. "Good morning," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Linton smiled, faint but sincere. "Good morning. It feels strange to be here again." "Familiar things often do after an absence," Miss Marple replied. They walked together for a short while. "I keep thinking about that morning," Mrs. Linton said quietly, "about how ordinary it seemed at first." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "ordinary moments are often the most revealing." Mrs. Linton glanced toward Mrs. Hargreaves's house. The curtains were still drawn. The door closed. "I trusted her," Mrs. Linton said. "We had known each other for years." "Trust is not foolish," Miss Marple replied. "It is generous, but generosity can be misused." They reached the end of the street and turned back. "I am grateful," Mrs. Linton said. "I do not know how to say it properly." Miss Marple smiled. "There is no need. You listen to your conscience. That is rarely easy." Mrs. Linton nodded. "I will be leaving the village for a while, just until things settle." "That may be wise," Miss Marple said. "Distance can be a kindness." As they parted, Mrs. Linton returned home, and Miss Marple continued her walk alone. She noted how people greeted Mrs. Linton now. Polite, careful, respectful. The village was recalibrating its relationships, adjusting its internal map. By noon, news had reached every corner. Mrs. Hargreaves had been formally charged. The old financial matter was under review. A wrong long accepted as misfortune had been named at last. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the sun warming her hands as she worked her knitting. Each stitch fell into place with quiet certainty. She reflected on how easily people accepted what fit their expectations, and how reluctant they were to examine what disturbed their comfort. Fogg was not the villain, she thought. It was merely an accomplice. In the afternoon, Mr. Doyle stopped by with a small basket of apples from his tree. He spoke awkwardly, as if unsure whether to acknowledge recent events directly. "It is good that things are clear now," he said finally. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Clarity can be bracing." He nodded. "I suppose we all saw what we wanted to see." Miss Marple met his eyes kindly. "That is very human." As evening approached, Hawthorne Row settled into its routines again. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn. The rhythm returned, altered but intact. Miss Marple stood at her window once more. The street did not glow with triumph. It did not demand applause. It simply existed, holding its memories quietly, as streets do. Truth had not arrived dramatically. It had arrived patiently. That night, sleep came easily to Miss Marple. She dreamed not of fog or fear, but of gardens and gates, and pathways that connected one place to another. When she woke, the dream faded, leaving behind a sense of completion. The following day brought small ceremonies of normal life. The shop reopened fully. Mrs. Peters greeted customers with her usual warmth, though her eyes held a deeper understanding now. Conversations shifted from speculation to reflection. People spoke more carefully, as if aware that words left impressions long after they were spoken. Miss Marple walked the back path one final time. The alley behind the houses was unchanged, yet it felt different. The gate at the end was secured properly now. The shed door remained closed, its latch firm. The earth where feet had once paused was smoothed over. Physical traces disappeared quickly. Human traces did not. Miss Marple returned to the front street and sat on her bench, watching the afternoon pass. Children played at the far end, their laughter light and unburdened. They knew nothing of fog used as cover or secrets held too long. And that, Miss Marple thought, was as it should be. Mrs. Peters approached with 2 cups of tea. "For you," she said, offering one. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence. "Do you think it will change us?" Mrs. Peters asked at last. What happened? Yes, Miss Marple replied. A little. And that is not a bad thing. Mrs. Peters nodded thoughtfully. I will never look at fog the same way again. Miss Marple smiled. Nor should you look at people the same way. Appearances are kind, but they are not guarantees. As dusk fell, the street lights flickered on. Their glow was steady, untroubled by mist. Miss Marple felt the gentle satisfaction of a puzzle, resolved not through cleverness alone, but through attention. She returned inside and placed her knitting aside. She sat by the fire and let her thoughts wander. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves, of fear and pride intertwined until both became a trap. She thought of Mrs. Linton, of courage, delayed, but not denied. She thought of how long injustice could hide when wrapped in respectability. Most of all, she thought of how truth rarely shouted. It waited. Later that evening, a light rain began to fall. Miss Marple watched it from her window, as it darkened the pavement and softened the edges of the world. The street absorbed it quietly. No fog rose. Miss Marple turned away from the window and extinguished the lamp. The mystery of Foggy Street had ended not with shock, but with understanding. The village would remember. It always did, and memory, when faced honestly, could be a gentle teacher. Miss Marple went to bed with that thought, content in the knowledge that clarity, once earned, had a way of staying. The fog had cleared, and the truth remained. Hawthorne Row returned to itself in small, careful steps. There were no celebrations, no dramatic speeches, no sudden transformations. The village simply adjusted. People greeted one another with a little more thought. Doors were closed a little more gently. Silence was treated with respect rather than suspicion. Mrs. Linton left the village quietly a few days later, not in shame but in recovery. She promised to return when the weight of memory felt lighter. Her house stood empty for a while then, patient as houses often are waiting without judgment. Mrs. Hargreaves did not return. Her absence settled into the street like a stone placed carefully on a grave, not to forget, but to mark where something ended. Miss Marple continued her routines. Tea at the same hour, walks at the same pace, knitting by the window as evening fell. Yet she noticed a difference in the street. People paused more often. They looked more closely. They listened. Fog still came to Hawthorne Row on certain mornings. It always would. But it no longer carried mystery in the same way. It was just fog again, weather not excuse. Miss Marple believed that was the real resolution. Not the uncovering of wrongdoing, but the quiet change that followed. When people learned that truth did not need to be dramatic, only patient. And patience, once practiced, had a way of staying.